Can you really learn to think like a genius? Yes, you can. And I'll prove it. Over my more than a decade of experience as a peer-reviewed academic, having taught countless students in both academic and business contexts, I've found that specific kinds of books have the ability to challenge your brain so much that they permanently transform your thinking ability. In this video, I'll share 8 of these books, as well as 2 core skills they help you develop that put you far ahead of everyone else. Starting with the first book on this list, Thought and Knowledge, An Introduction to Critical Thinking by Diane Halpern. Now, before we dive into this book, let me explain how I've chosen the 8 books on this list. Each of these 8 books is divided into 4 books in 2 separate categories. These categories are 1, books on intelligence and rationality, and 2, books on normative thinking and evaluation. As we progress through this list, I'll reveal how reading each type of book builds your intelligence, and I'll back this up with solid evidence. And so with that said, let's take a look at Halpern's book here, Thought and Knowledge, which belongs to our first category of books here. So many of you have asked me what book I would recommend for improving your critical thinking skills as they apply to everyday decision making, problem solving, and communication. And this is definitely the absolute best book on this topic you'll find out there. And why do I say that with such confidence? Well, Halpern, an accomplished cognitive scientist in her own right, has essentially laid out an entire course on critical thinking in this book, incorporating nearly all approaches, methods, and frameworks for critical thinking you'll find spread out among many other books out there on this same topic. Because of this book is almost 600 pages, but don't let that scare you off, as each of the chapters can be read separately. And there are multiple hands-on exercises you can do in each of these chapters to fine-tune and actively practice each critical thinking skill. But hold on a second. Building your critical thinking skills doesn't actually make you more intelligent, does it? I mean, isn't my claim here a little bit unscientific? Well, let's take a look at the next book on our list here, The Neuroscience of Intelligence by Richard Heyer. Although Heyer rarely mentions the subject of critical thinking, it's safe to say he would be sympathetic to the view that building your critical thinking skills doesn't actually build your intelligence, let alone building genius. Heyer, citing a large body of research over decades, argues that the evidence is clear that what is called G factor, often referred to also as general intelligence, is mostly genetic, is measured by IQ, and that regardless of any social interventions, brain training, or learning interventions, IQ and the underlying G factor it measures simply cannot be meaningfully changed. And so that's where our next book on this list comes in, Intelligence and How to Get It, Why Schools and Cultures Count by Richard Nisbett. Nisbett, equally as qualified to speak on this topic as Heyer, argues precisely the opposite, that this G factor is largely determined by environmental factors, and that although there is a genetic component, it does not play the largest role. As a result, he claims G factor, or general intelligence, can be meaningfully changed. And so the reason I'm sharing these books with you so far and the role they play in shaping your intelligence will become clear momentarily. But in the meantime, let's ask an important question, namely, how is it that 2 researchers, both equally qualified and knowledgeable in their fields, can come to such completely different conclusions? Well, that's an important question, and it's equally important to note that the work of both Heyer and Nisbett have been subject to various biting and incisive critiques. And so this all leads us to our last book in this first category, What Intelligence Tests Miss by Keith Stanovich. Stanovich, yet another extremely knowledgeable cognitive scientist, does what I think is a sort of sidestep to this entire conversation between Heyer and his supporters on one side and Nisbett and his supporters on the other side. And what exactly do I mean by this? Well, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Heyer is correct and that G, or general intelligence, is mostly genetic and also largely not changeable. Does that mean that your intelligence cannot therefore be changed? Well, now, that depends entirely on what aspects of mental ability we choose to include in the category of intelligence. Does creativity count? Do the mental abilities of savants count? Does critical thinking count? Well, Stanovich aptly points out that critical thinking has a fairly low correlation with G factor intelligence, again, the type of intelligence measured by IQ tests. In fact, research has shown that critical thinking and G-factor type intelligence have a correlation of about 0.3, which still is a correlation, but a fairly weak one. Translation into English? You can be extremely intelligent in the standard definition, yet extremely dumb in certain other ways, specifically with respect to metacognitive reasoning and decision making. And so now here's the reason I'm recommending these books to you so far, and precisely why I claim you can achieve genius level thinking by reading them. Because even assuming that your IQ just is the way it is and there's nothing you can do about it, there is very solid research demonstrating that you can increase your critical thinking skills, your ability to solve problems, identify biases in your and others' thinking, reflect on the quality of your thinking and improve it, and make better decisions based on the analysis of data and their underlying assumptions. And critical thinking has been shown to be a strong predictor of success outcomes as well. And so, in addition to reading Halpern's book, reading the 3 additional books in this category, which all have conflicting viewpoints, will force you to think critically about your own conclusions, something that is an elite skill which very few people practice. And that's precisely why our next category of books here, books on normative thinking and evaluation, is so crucial. Because in order to truly think like a genius, you have to practice a special subset of critical thinking, a type of thinking that underlies all other types of thinking, what is called normative thinking. And that brings us to our first of 4 books in this category, Thick Evaluation by Simon Kurchin, which is a book from my own field of value theory. So let's circle back to the concept of intelligence for a moment again, and recall that there are fundamental disagreements among equally qualified scientists over what intelligence actually is. As Halpern writes, I believe the static notion of intelligence is wrong and damaging. If any individual can learn to be a better thinker and subsequently can use newly acquired thinking skills across a wide variety of contexts, then I believe by definition that person has learned to be more intelligent. Yet Heyer would sharply disagree. As he states, the best teachers can maximize a student's learning, but the intelligence level of the student creates some limitations, although it is fashionable to assert that no student has inherent limitations. But who's correct here? Well, my own view here is that this isn't a disagreement about scientific evidence. It is instead a disagreement about how we are using the word intelligence. And it's not a trite or trivial debate at all. In other words, it's not just a matter of semantics, as the way we choose to use this word has real-world consequences. And this is because, as Kurchin would admit, the term intelligence is what is called a form of thick evaluation. But what is this, and why is it important? You see, we use words such as good and bad, right and wrong all the time. These are what are called forms of thin evaluation. In other words, it's pretty obvious that these terms are themselves simple value judgments. In fact, you might state that these terms are, in a sense, the basic unit of value judgment. Yet, let's take a look at words such as fat. The term fat can be used in a neutral, or in what is often called a descriptive way, as in the sentence, a fat person is someone who has over 25% body fat. Yet, that's clearly not all people usually mean when they use the term fat, is it? No. Instead, we use fat as a form of thick evaluation. In other words, on one view, we combine the description, a fat person is someone who has over 25% body fat, with the implicit evaluation, and this is a bad thing. Or, depending on the time period or cultural context, and this is a good thing. And this is probably exactly what is getting confused, not only within the current debates over the usage of the term intelligence, but also with so many of the words we use every single day. In fact, how many words can you think of that you use every day, which you might be misusing or otherwise causing you to make certain value judgments which may or may not be justified? And this is precisely why reading Kurchin's book is so important. Yet it's also precisely why reading our next book in this category, Choosing Normative Concepts by Matti Eklund, is so important. Consider for a moment that every decision you make requires you to make a value judgment, a judgment that something is either good or bad. Even getting out of bed in the morning requires you to make the judgment that doing so is good, or at the very least, that doing so is justified. But how are you making these judgments? And how could they be otherwise? Eklund's book here is yet another academic work from my own field of value theory that will get you to think on the most fundamental levels about how you're justifying your decisions and judgments. But how about even your most fundamental knowledge? After all, didn't I make the bold assertion that this type of thinking is a type of thinking that underlies all other types of thinking? Well, that's a bold claim. And it's precisely what the last two books on our list emphasize: Virtues of the Mind, an inquiry into the nature of virtue and the ethical foundations of knowledge, and The Authority of Reason by Gene Hampton. Although the arguments in each of these books are quite different, they each touch on an important central point, namely that value judgment precedes epistemic judgment. In other words, in order to even make judgments about what you believe or claim to know, even facts such as the earth is round and 2 + 2 = 4, you have to first make a value judgment. No, I don't mean you have to make a judgment something along the lines of, I believe these because it's valuable to believe them. No, instead, it's a bit more subtle than that. Instead, you first have to implicitly assert, I am justified in believing these are true because the method of reasoning I am using to believe them itself is justified. And the idea of justification is itself, guess what? A form of thick evaluation. Okay, but where does this all leave us? In fact, it leaves us with this simple point. We must constantly make value judgments about the world, even at the most fundamental level of our reasoning, whether we like it or not. And so, because this type of reasoning is so fundamental, we better get good, really good, at this type of reasoning if we want to become genius-level thinkers. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.